Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group. A little bit about the group. We meet every month. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover any and all topics related to .NET. You can find meeting information posted on meetup.com at the link listed below. I'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors, Tech Systems and Inedo, PostSharp and DevExpress for sponsoring the prizes, which will be given using the evaluation form, and the web hosting courtesy of NIS Technologies. We'd also like to thank Manning.com for their exclusive offer. We have 35% discount on a selection of Manning books, and you can find those books at the link listed there, and that link will also be shared in chat in just a little bit. You'll have to utilize the discount code MTPCLEC21, and that will get you 35% off the selection of books. Some general information. Please keep in mind that participation is always encouraged. There is no such thing as a stupid question, except the one that is not being asked. So if you have something on your mind, feel free to ask it. Chances are someone else has that same question in mind. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphones to prevent any background noise. And we like to keep it casual but organized, meaning jump in at any point in time with a question or a comment. But at the same time, we want to give our presenters some time to go through the slides and the demos. And lastly, the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with the link provided in chat in just a little bit. Tonight's feature presentation is GraphQL for .NET Developers by Jeremy Likness. Did I pronounce that correctly, Jeremy?
You did. A+.
Excellent. All right. So Jeremy is the Senior Program Manager for the .NET Data at Microsoft. He has 30 years of software development experience. He's an internationally recognized author and speaker. And before he joined Microsoft, he was a former 8-time Microsoft MVP. He joined Microsoft in July 2017 as a cloud developer advocate. And currently he is working closely with the EF Core and Spark for .NET teams. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jeremy.
So I will share just a couple more things about myself. My personal mission is to empower developers to be their best. That's why I love invitations to user groups, if I can share what I can and answer questions. This will be a very casual presentation. Feel free to interrupt me with questions as often as you like. And I will hang out for a little while at the end as well if you have follow-up questions. So we'll do that. So a lot of people know me from tech. And I do have a blog. It's not as frequently updated because I post through the corporate blog at Microsoft now, but that does have some recent items there that I haven't moved over. I was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease back in February 2020. And so I'm an advocate for that and share that. And I have astrophotography as a hobby. And if you haven't heard the official EF Core, well, it's actually not official, but the unofficial EF Core theme song Unicorns Kickin', that link in the upper left, bit.ly Unicorns Kickin', something to check out. I had a lot of fun with that. My engineering manager that I work with on the EF Core team, Arthur Vickers, produced the music for that, so check that out. I'm also doing a challenge this year. The one thing that's proven to slow the progression of Parkinson's disease is consistent exercise. So I'm taking on an extra burpee every day. So basically today is the 83rd day of the year, so it's 83 burpees today and working up to 365. So if you're interested in seeing what that's about, I record every one and post a video summary at the end of each week. But let's talk about GraphQL because that's what you came here for. GraphQL is an interesting entity. I'm going to preface this by saying that it is similar but not the same as OData. Similarity it shares is it is an API that goes over REST endpoints, but there the similarity kind of ends, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in general, it's an interface to data for front ends. There's a temptation to use it for backend microservice cross chatter. It certainly can be used for that, but that's not what it was designed for. It was designed specifically for the front end to address concerns with fetching information from the back end. And there are certainly other services designed specifically for back channel communication like gRPC that may make more sense there. It's a query language for APIs. It contains a specification for mutating data. We'll talk about what that looks like. There's a runtime associated with it, and there are definitely tools involved with it, and we'll get into some of the tools and look into that because that's part of the whole experience. And just to give you some background of my experiences with GraphQL, as .NET Data Program Manager, I'm always looking at ways that .NET developers interact with data. And I've been researching GraphQL for probably the past year and a half now to understand what the experience is like in the .NET ecosystem and ways that we may be able to help improve that. And so what does researching mean? It means going out, checking out the tools, the SDKs, talking to teams in Microsoft who are using GraphQL. It's actually used quite a bit internally, and also going out to developers like yourselves and having conversations about your experience. And that also includes looking outside of the .NET ecosystem as a comparison. Lee Byron is one of the original creators of GraphQL and described as a data fetching API powerful enough to describe all of Facebook. So the problem that they were trying to solve is if you've been on Facebook, there's a lot of information on a page, and that information is dynamic and can change quite frequently. And in a traditional workflow, especially if you're using REST services that aren't documented and aren't using something like an OData, the problem is anytime you need to change the shape of the payload on the front end, you typically need to go to the back end and add another overload or parameter or flow through those changes. So I may have a drop-down that just requires an ID and a name, and I may have another list that requires the full thing. Well, in traditional REST approaches, those are probably two endpoints or parameter passed to an API. And the idea here is that can we stand up something on the server that's smart enough to take complex requests from the client, not only provide those requests in a meaningful way, but do it in a performant way, and in a way that adheres to security as well. And you'll see what that looks like in a moment. So the part and parcel of GraphQL, there's a query specification. It's a schema language. It's a typed API. So that means you have definitions, which also means that you're able to have discovery. In other words, you can have clients ask an endpoint, there's a known request that you can say, give me all of the things you're capable of, and then you can build up requests and responses based on that. Mutations are similar to queries, but they're known to have side effects. The runtime is what actually provides the information. We're going to talk about the concept of a resolver and subscriptions, and then we'll get into some defer and streaming. Defer and streaming are future, and I didn't have time to get defer into this demo. But basically what defer does is it allows you to prioritize the slow parts of a request. And a very good example would be, let's say I get a list of components, and those components each have an image associated with them, and it's a large image. I may want to render that component list before I'm waiting for all the bytes of the image to download. So if I happen to be serving my image through the API, I can defer that request and have that piece come separately. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's possible as well. So why use GraphQL? These are not my reasons. These are not the reasons that GraphQL advertises. This is from speaking with people who are using it in production. These are the trends that they shared with me for reasons that they value GraphQL and use that. One is that it is a language it's not connected to a specific language or platform. There are solutions across all platforms, but in and of itself, just like REST, just like even OData to an extent, it's a open ecosystem. So for companies that are producing publicly consumable APIs and that have very heterogeneous teams, then the availability of this is important because it allows one solution to span the different technology platforms. You can have a single endpoint that's discoverable with the schema. And in fact, There are a lot of companies that will use this to form a facade in front of existing backend services. A key piece of this is overfetching and not getting too much data, but getting just what the client wants. And that's all the way through to the database, and we'll talk about that more. There's a shared contract, so the client and the server know what they're doing. It provides a single lens across data. There's a concept of reusable fragments. So if you happen to have a signature of data that you reuse, you can give it an alias and just mark it that way. You can evolve the API without versioning. For example, if a client no longer needs a column, it just simply doesn't request that column anymore. There's no need to make changes for that. The built-in tools allow rapid development, and schema stitching is a very interesting concept. What that allows you to do is you can aggregate multiple GraphQL endpoints together. And it's not just for the sake of aggregation, but you can do smart things with it. For example, let's say that there's a company that has an API that provides weather information, and there's another company that provides an API that delivers information about restaurants. You could potentially schema stitch those APIs and present an endpoint that provides restaurants with outdoor seating on days of good weather. And you would do that through this schema stitching technology that is an optimized way of fetching from the different backends. I won't have time to go into that in more detail, but it's something that's a powerful feature. I said feature. Card mode, GraphQL Landscape. This is a link out because I didn't want to steal anyone's logos and icons, but if you go to the GraphQL site itself, you can see the companies that have adopted and opted into being presented here as companies that use it. So adoption is pretty wide, and there's some fairly large players using GraphQL. And again, as I mentioned, Microsoft certainly uses that with our internal teams. So what about OData? I'm asked this all the time, and I'm curious, I don't know, is there a hand raise? There's probably not a hand raise on this like Teams, but if you want to type into chat, I'm curious if you use OData or if you use GraphQL, throw a little GraphQL +1 or OData +1 in chat, just out of curiosity. And I won't wait for all those to come in, but it'd be interesting to see. I know it's a small sample size. So OData, okay. So OData is very similar, but there are differences, and this table is my attempt to show kind of the differences. One huge difference is with schema and projections. Now, OData does allow projections, but if you've worked with really complex object graphs, you know that there's limitations and nuances to how deep you can go. And if you have cycles, for example, a child that references a parent, that references a child, that references a parent, GraphQL was designed to be completely flexible around defining that graph that you're getting back. GraphQL is real-time subscriptions. I'm going to show an example of that, but that's a very straightforward way to get real-time data. There's lazy loading with defer. You can batch requests. So if I need 3 different dropdowns on a page instead of issuing 3 different requests, I can issue a single request and get back the data for all 3 in that request without changing anything on the server. For query optimization, one thing that OData tends to do is sort of hand off queries to iQueryable, which is a very powerful engine, but it doesn't give you as much flexibility of, for example, let's say that I want to provide you a component, and that component has text properties that come from the database and an image property that comes from disk. So I have 2 different services that are providing it. With GraphQL, it's very straightforward to synthesize those 2 into a single response using these resolvers. A lot of people use GraphQL as a facade to front ends, and the footprint for GraphQL is definitely cross-language and platform. It grew up in Facebook, whereas OData growing up at Microsoft is something that is cross-platform, but it tends to be mostly used in the .NET ecosystem. And then GraphQL, I call it a backend for front ends. It sort of drives the front end experience, whereas OData is more about serializing queries over REST. And if you disagree with that or have anything to add, feel free to unmute or share in chat. So if I were to sum these up in an elevator pitch, I would say GraphQL is for materializing an object graph based on a specification. OData is to serialize link over REST. We do have stand-ups. Our .NET data team does a community stand-up every other week. This is where we invite guests from the community as well as have members of the team feature a topic. And we recently had the maintainer of Hot Chocolate, which is a GraphQL client I'm going to show you, as well as a Microsoft employee, a good friend of mine, Hassan, who does a ton of work with OData and contributes to OData. Both of them came on to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, and it wasn't intended to be like a challenge. It was more just a discussion on when to use what. There was a little bit of back and forth over some features, which made it interesting. But that YouTube link will take you to that video. If you want something easy to remember, though, we have a bit.ly short link. I'm sorry, an AKMS short link. That's the Microsoft link shortener, aka.ms/EF standups. So just the letter E, the letter F, the word standups. That'll take you to our playlist of all our previous stand-ups, and this is the most recent one, so you'll land right on it. So what about GraphQL for .NET? There are certainly more solutions than this, but I would say 99% of developers that I spoke with use one of these two. So GraphQL.net, I have the link to the repo. It has by far the most downloads, by far the highest usage, and has been around the longest. And I'll just say it's a great choice of a name. So when people are looking for a solution, they gravitate towards GraphQL.net, because if you're looking for GraphQL on .NET, what are you going to go for? GraphQL.net sounds that way. In fact, it was interesting because a lot of the developers that we spoke with actually felt that this was an official Microsoft offering because of the name, which it is not. Neither one of these are official Microsoft offerings. Hot Chocolate is run by a company called Chili Cream. It has the more complete implementation of the latest specification, so they keep very closely with iterations. Their main coordinator, if you will, is a member of the GraphQL Foundation. And it's a very positive developer experience. And again, this is not me speaking from my personal experience, but 100% of the developers that I spoke with who have worked with both preferred Hot Chocolate. And there are different reasons for people adopting GraphQL.net, because Hot Chocolate's newer, so it didn't have some capabilities, and GraphQL.net runs on the .NET framework. Hot Chocolate is .NET Core technologies only. But I share both because your mileage may vary and you'll want to look at both packages, but sharing just kind of the feedback. So now let's talk demo time, and I'm probably going to show you a couple demos because I've been very focused on producing content for the MVP Summit, which is next week. And so I didn't completely finish this demo, but I think it's at a state that shows what I want it to show. And then I have another finished demo I can refer you to as well. But I wanted to have something fresh for this user group. I didn't want to just recycle the same demo. So what I created is an interesting solution. I like to write demos that solve problems I have, because if I can actually use them, that's even better. And the problem that I'm looking to solve is, one of my hobbies is astrophotography. And in astrophotography, you run into a lot of interesting nuances. And one of those is something called back focus. If you're not familiar with back focus, it's really a feature of the optics. And by the way, the whole set of components from the telescope to the camera is called the imaging train or the optical train. You'll hear both of those expressions. But basically at the top, we have the OTA, which is the optical tube assembly. That's the actual telescope. And then I have what's called a field reducer flattener. Basically the telescope, because it has curved lenses, will have distortion at the edges. So you can have a correction lens that refocuses them. You lose some of the magnification, so you get what's called a shorter focal length, but you get a flat field, and then you get nicer pictures with that. But the thing is, on the lens side of this, there's a back focus length, which is the distance from the lens that the image converges. It's separate from focus, and I won't get into all the technical details. There's if it's blurry or not, but then there's a space where the image actually converges from all the light rays. And that'll be different from telescope to telescope. And the challenge is, if you don't get the back focus correctly, I'll show you what happens. And so the way we deal with that is we have these spacers. And here I'm showing a couple spacers that get me to it. I don't know if let me move my chat over to the side. Okay, so my video is still running. So I have this is a sleeve. So this allows me to take something like this and slide it in, which is what's called a compression ring, because you loosen the screw, you slide this in, you tighten the screw. And that's useful because if you have a camera attached and you want to align it correctly, you can rotate it. But you can see this, if I try to marry these two pieces together, these threads work perfect. But there's another example where the threads don't work at all. So there's a ton of different adapters of different sizes. And it's a little bit of a challenge to achieve back focus. You have to find the right combination. Basically, this back focus is 55 millimeters. This camera has what's called a 12.5 millimeter thread recess, which is the distance that this component screws into the camera. So I basically have 12.5. This is an 11 millimeter separator. This is a 21 millimeter. This is a 16.5, and that gets me to 55, which is the perfect back focus. And the thing is, if you don't hit back focus, you can still focus your telescope, but what'll happen is you'll get what's on the left as opposed to what's on the right. And I'm going to zoom in a second, but if you can see it here, notice in these corners that these stars are starting to stretch out, and they're stretching away from the center of the lens. Whereas here, they're still perfect circles, even in the edges. If we zoom in, you can see that even more pronounced, these elongated stars right here, versus, now these are slightly elongated, but that's because of the orbit of the Earth. That's more of an issue with what's called tracking than back focus, but they're still consistent. So this sort of shape is consistent throughout the image. So we're going to solve that problem, and we're going to do that a few ways. First, I'm going to walk you through the server setup, and what I created was a minimal API .NET 6 project. I actually just realized that my Visual Studio Code has the client project loaded, so we will pull up Visual Studio for the server project. Astroadapt. And I'm just going to step through the setup so you know as a developer, sort of, if you decided to go with hot chocolate, what would the experience for getting started look like? So the first thing, if we go to our, and then let me use my favorite command. What's the trick to collapse this GoToMeeting bar at the top? Do you know? Can I move it over here? Oh, I can move it over here. Nope, it comes back. That's all right. So we're going to do window, close all but tool windows. I call that the remove distractions button. And then we're going to open up. So the way this is structured, by the way, is I have a models, which is pretty much standalone. You can run the solutions, the business logic and everything is inside of this. And I even created a console app, this example solver, that'll solve based on that, just to show that. Then I have a data project that uses SQLite to store the data in the database. It's pretty straightforward. I have manufacturers, components, and solutions that I'm saving. And then I have this GraphQL server. And the first thing I did was I installed some packages. So you can see here, I've got Hot Chocolate's ASP.NET Core package. I'm integrating with Entity Framework. So I've got this data entity framework. And then we've got some analyzers that help us out with things that we're doing with types and whatnot. I'm also including my data in my engine project down here. So that's really it for things that I had to pull in. The next thing you do is you configure your types. You tell GraphQL what types are you going to expose. So if we look at this, I've got this line, add GraphQL server, and then I'm adding types. Ignore everything for now except this query type. So this is the first thing we'll look at, which is queries. And then we have projections, filtering, and sorting, which is part of the middleware. I've got cores. Of course, demo cores is allow anywhere, so on and so forth. So we'll drive down that a little bit. This middleware is important though, projections, filtering, and sorting, and I'll show you why in a moment. And then we need to stand up the endpoint, which is really just use endpoint, endpoints map GraphQL. So by default, it'll set up at /GraphQL as the end of the URL, but you can certainly override that and change that and do what you want with it. But pretty straightforward setup, I think. This is the whole program.cs, and I can even save a line by bringing models out. And there we go. I just shaved off a line of code live on a presentation. My work here is done. Let's see what the query looks like. So here's the query class. Now, I don't want you to get distracted down here for a second. I want to show you that, let's say I wanted to return the numbers 1, 2, 3 as a GraphQL option. What I could do is say public int get integers, and Hot Chocolate does use conventions, so this get will be removed and my entity type will just be integers, and I can say basically new 1, 2, 3. Just by doing that with the way Hot Chocolate's set up, because I've registered this type, it automatically creates what's called a resolver for every property on the type. And so when someone asks for integers, it knows it resolves them by calling this method, and this is exposed. Well, resolvers can be more involved with that. So I've done that. I've got a resolver here that is getting components from my context. So that is just going to Entity Framework and handing it to GraphQL. I've got manufacturers like that. And then we're going to talk about resolvers a little bit later, so I'll wait before I get into the resolvers. But just knowing that we have this get inventory and we have this get manufacturers, let's see what an endpoint in this looks like. So I'm going to jump over to my browser. Let me find the right one. And I'm going to hit my endpoint, which, because I have a new browser, it's not in my history, but that's okay. It is not this one. 7161. No, that's my Blazor WASM. 5247. It is this one. Okay, 5247. And it sent an invalid response. Did I grab the wrong one? I grabbed the insecure one, didn't I? Yeah, 7247. Okay, so the first thing that's going to pop up is this interesting thing, which may seem familiar if you're familiar with like Swagger, for example. Let's come back here. This is your GraphQL control panel. This is built in. You can obviously suppress it for production deployments. But when you're in a development loop, this is a very fast way to explore your GraphQL API. Basically, by exposing that query type, what happens is here I've got the ability to, let me zoom this in a little bit for you. I've got the ability to pick my query type here, and then this is immediately returning the things that I can get basically from that endpoint. I can get images, I can get inventory, I can drill into this. So this is saying that it has a where and an order by. So I've got filtering and sorting. If I look at component, it tells me what's on a component. There's back focus, there's this clone option, there's all of these different properties. So from that, I can construct an operation. So an operation looks like this. Let me make sure we are still online. Yep, okay. So an operation looks like this. I'm going to do a query. And what I'm interested in is inventory. And maybe all I want is just the ID because I already have an index somewhere. Well, if I do that and I click run, you can see over here, I get just the ID back. Now, what's important to note is if we look at our backend, notice that this command is select ID from components. So this went all the way through to the database. We're not just grabbing data and then creating a DTO and sending it down. We're actually using that projection all the way down to the database. Let's try something else. Let's add the model name. And let's do a filter. So I've got an order. So I want to order by model and ascending. So if we run that, now we get model over here. And if we look at our query, it's model, order by model. So very tight coupling between the downstream backend and what the front end's requesting. You can also do things like, let's see, what else? Oh, for example, manufacturers. Manufacturer has a name, and it has a list of components that belong to that manufacturer, which has a model, but it also has a manufacturer, which also has a list of components, which also has an ID. So now I've done that cycle that I'm talking about. I went from manufacturer into a component, into my model, and then I'm grabbing the manufacturer off of that component and then going back into components. And this works just fine. You can see I get the nested result right here. Another thing I might want to do, I mentioned we can do 2 queries. So I might want to just get the names of manufacturers and then get the model names of components. So that'd be inventory. And so that's 2 requests. You can see it comes back and I got manufacturers there and I've got inventory there. So single response back. So hopefully you start to see some of the flexibility of how this API endpoint is working. So that's Banana Popcake. For projections, filtering, and sorting, I basically did 2 things. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but I installed the package. This one right here is what's giving me the ability to do projections, filtering, and sorting And then on the query definition, you may have seen this. I had this. So it's an opt-in model, and you can get even more fine-grained than this. Using projection basically just enables saying if you only ask for 2 fields, go ahead and pass that all the way down to the backend provider, so it's just grabbing it. Filtering and sorting also passes through, but here's an interesting thing. OData was written for serialization of queries. So OData has a first-class concept of filtering and sorting. GraphQL is literally just this request for an object graph. So there's no standard for filtering and sorting. I think it's being proposed for the specification, and I need to actually get a little more up to date on that. But as of last time I checked, there is no official spec for filtering and sorting. So most of the clients implement their own version of the spec. In the case of Hot Chocolate, it's going to add that convention that's similar to how MongoDB requests work, where you basically shape the requests and then you have ascending or descending. So let me show that again right here. So if we did manufacturers, let's do inventory because I know that is sortable. So I can do inventory order. So this is all added by Hot Chocolate, but then it parses it and passes it down through the database. So we can say model, let's do descending. And then we can also do a where model actually, is it, say, back focus? It's greater than 55. So where back focus is greater than 55, if I run that, you can see my Edge HD telescope has that. And then let's say greater than 15, and we'll get all of my telescopes, all 2. You can see it's sorted descending. And again, if we look at the query behind this, you can see that not only did it grab everything I wanted, but Entity Framework was kind enough to tell me that there's a way to improve my query. So, but here's where back focus is greater than, order by, etc. Let me come back. Okay, and then annotations. So the only other thing this project doesn't have, or yes, it does. So these annotations here are how you, one way to control whether or not it's enabled. If I took these off, I would no longer have that extra metadata provided. Let me just look at what we're going to next. So resolvers are an interesting concept. The way GraphQL works is every leaf on your graph has a resolver. So when I ask for a property, the property has a resolver. When I ask for a component, the component has a resolver. What Hot Chocolate does for me is if it knows I'm getting models from the database, then the resolver is the code I write to fetch the model from the database, and then it automatically creates a resolver for each property. So here, I'm showing an example from my other repo that I'll also show you, where these are observations contain an ID, a date, a telescope, a target, and these are extensions. So the actual C# type that I'm using doesn't have some properties on it, and I'm going to show you that with the component. But you can extend that and resolve it either from the same data source or from a different data source. So properties are automatic. They can be overridden. They don't have to be from the same data source. There is context passed into your resolver when you write it in Hot Chocolate for services and parent values. And then you can basically say for this node, return this value. And we'll get to the client in a second. But let me show you what a resolver looks like. So what we've done, go here. What I've done here is when I set up my actual application, we had this query type here. We have Astro app. We have some extra things. Let's look at cores, endpoints. Let's look at the query again. So here on the query, we've got this get images async. So this is another GraphQL value that I can request, only this one is using a service to create the image response because I'm saving them and retrieving them from disk instead of storing them in the database. So that shows basically fanning out to a separate service. If I have a component extension, so if we look at a component, first let's do this. Let's look at my model for a component. And that model has an ID, a manufacturer, model, thread recess, etc. So it has all of the data in the database. My model right now is ignorant of the fact that it can have an image. Has no clue. That's something that I wanted to be able to write a console application to do this. And so images wouldn't factor in, but I wanted to be able to enhance it with those or extend it basically when it made sense. So the way we extend it is we create a extension, believe it or not. Sounds a little, those are my extensions. Sorry, I gotta go back to this extension. There we go. So here's an example of an extension. So I'm using this attribute. I'm saying I want to extend component. And I want to remember there's conventions. So get goes away. So the property name becomes image, and async is a convention, just so we know it's an async endpoint. Here I'm injecting the parent, which this is extending the component. So I'm getting a reference to the component that's being requested. This is a resolver, by the way. So what this is saying is when someone asks for a component, they can also ask for image. And if they do ask for image, this is how you get the image. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the ID off that component and the component type and calling my other service. So when I do that, I can now go into Banana Popcake and I can request an image. And the image has, oh, I did that in the wrong place. This is still my where clause. Right here, I can say image. And the image has a file name, a type. Oh, that's the type of the image itself, and the image data. Let's say these two things. So now, when I run this, I get a response back that's still a component, but this component now has an image and it has a byte array. And this is expanded for us in the UI. It actually comes back as bytes in the payload. But then I can show that image and extend the model that way. So that's very useful to be able to make a single request that looks like a single request, even though it's going to two different services to provide the response. So now we've seen sort of how I stand this up on the server side. Let's go into the client and look how we work with the client. And first I want to show you what the running client looks like. And I do apologize for not having it completely fit and polished, but it is one that I'm going to use myself, so it will get there, I promise. But let's do, I need to grab that URL again. Hold on one second. There we go. So I want to come to this one. 7161 is the magic number. So let's go localhost 7161. So this is a Blazor app. We're loading. So now I've got this surface area. I'm going to zoom back out so I can fit more. basically I've got the target, which is pointing to my target. That's my lens. So I have different telescopes that have different adapter sizes, and you can see this small text that's in the corners explains what the adapter is. And there's different rules for how they combine. And then I need to get this to my sensor. So I have two different sensors in my system right now. I will eventually add a third because I use a regular DSL camera. These are dedicated astrophotography cameras, and they have different types of connectors. They're both M42, which is a 42 millimeter thread, but one's a male and one's a female. So one's recessed and one's extruded. And then here's the inventory of adapters that I have available. So what I want to do is I want to build an image train. I want to solve for that back focus. And in a very generic sense, I want to find how to get to perfect back focus with the least components possible. So that's my goal. However, I may want to throw a wrench into things. For example, I may be using a filter, and there's a filter wheel that electronically swaps out filters. So I want to factor that into the image train. So then I would want a solution that includes the filter wheel. If that's the case, then I'm going to include a different set. But for this one, I'm going to make it complex. I'm going to include all the components. And then I'm going to tell it to find me solutions. So this is the engine. If we have time at the end of the talk, we can go through how the engine works. It's basically an optimized brute force attack. So it does bifurcations of basically what adapters will fit this adapter, take that from the inventory, see what's left, but it has some optimizations with it. So I'm just going to click this. So now it's making an attempt. This will quickly grow to, like, for some problems that I've submitted, it's gone up to like 16 million attempts. And then this is telling me it's found 11,000 successes, but sometimes those are duplicates, so it's going to whittle those down. It's telling you like one of the solutions finished, but it was outside of my tolerance. It was basically not in alignment with back focus. I haven't had time to troubleshoot why we suddenly freeze here, but if we give it a second and we actually wait and don't exit the page, I'm confident that this will return a nice list of solutions for me. And if you aren't aware of this trick, I'm going to reveal a secret that I try not to share too widely, but if you move the mouse clockwise, because that's the way most spinners go, I'm pretty sure that helps it get to the solution faster. Although I haven't tested this with screen share running, so it may just be a question of, all right, there we go. My confidence paid out. So I have a thread locking up somewhere that I need to get at. So there's basically the way this is sorted is I'm going to sort by how close to perfect back focus it is, which the back focus on my telescope is 146.5. So all of these would be perfect back focus. Then I want the least number of components. And then I have a weight because components have preferences of where they are in the image train. For example, your filter wheel can be anywhere, but it's more optimal to have it closest to the actual camera or sensor. So this is telling me what that solution looks like. When this example is complete, I'll do a visual representation of it, and then you'll be able to save it and print it out for later. So it'll be a very useful tool, but this is telling me basically I have an adapter called a Visual Back T2M42. Then I'm going to connect my filter wheel to that. Then I'm going to connect the M42 2 millimeter, this 21 millimeter, and then attach it to the camera. And that's the shortest solution with the least components. There's 3 of those. So as you could see, that all happened sort of in real time. So it was a long running job in the background. I had to show status update, and then I had to show the final. Did someone have a question? No question. I think Steve C number 2, if you're off of mute, if you
I'm
aren't.
sorry. I switched from a phone to a laptop. I didn't
No
notice.
worries. And what was I going to, oh, so let's talk about how that worked. So for the client, come back here. So we talked about resolvers. So for the client, there's a few steps. So the way the client works in Hot Chocolate, the client technology is called, take a guess, Strawberry Shake. And Strawberry Shake will look at the schema, allow you to define what part of the schema is interesting to you, and then use source generators to build clients for it. So what does that mean? Well, Hot Chocolate itself actually has a great tutorial that I just come back to. So if I do GraphQL strawberry shake, get the chili cream platform. Here's the instructions getting started. And what you're going to do is you add a tool manifest because there's a tool that works with it. So if you've ever used connected services, which is what OData it uses, you've got an experience inside of Visual Studio where you can point it to an OData endpoint. It'll ask for the schema and it'll generate a client for you. Because there's not an extension right now in Visual Studio for this, although I would say if you work with GraphQL and want one, reach out to Microsoft and ask frequently and often because I'm pushing hard for us to do that. Then you can use a tool like this. And what this tool does is basically, so you install some packages and then you point it to an endpoint and it pulls down a schema. Now this schema is a standard schema. I can point that to GitHub, which has a GraphQL interface, and download that schema. But this is the definition of all the things I can do. Now I'm showing you what's called a code first solution, which is my preferred way to work. And that is I described my endpoint in code and let Hot Chocolate figure out the schema. But there is also the possibility of doing schema first. So what I'm about to show you, you can actually build this document and generate the services and the clients from the document itself, which is something that distributed teams tend to like to do because they use the document as a source of truth and iterate on that and then use different technologies to fan it out. So if I go into my Blazor WASM project, this is the schema that it pulled down. So at the very top level, it tells me I can run queries, I can run mutations, and I can do subscriptions, which the subscriptions are the real-time updates. There's also particular types. For example, if I'm asking for a type of solution that contains a component, it contains the target, which is the telescope, the sensor, which is the camera, an array of component inputs, back focus, the length, and the weight. So this is what I was showing on that last page. Here's my queries. So this is the inventory query. You can see it has where component filter input, order list of component sort input, and it returns a list of components. So then somewhere else, this component filter input will be defined. So we can double click on that and copy that. And let's go ahead and just jump to it in this document. So for the filter input, you can see there's an ID, which is a GUID, manufacturer, which is a different type of filter input. So let's look at the comparable GUID operation filter input going down the train. And these are just those JSON-like syntax that you use in the client. So if we look at this filter, we can see it's defined a few places. And so the things I can do with the GUID is I can say equal, not equal, in, not in, greater than, not greater than equal, etc. So these are how the operations are defined. And I didn't have to do any of that. Hot Chocolate did based on me putting that attribute on it. So this is something that in Visual Studio Code, there's an extension from the GraphQL Foundation that will provide schema validation so you can edit this and get auto completion. I do have a ticket on our backlog where I've asked our tools team to provide IntelliSense for these schema document files in Visual Studio so that we have a similar experience. And it is in the backlog. It's probably not prioritized for some time immediately soon, but I'll keep on top of that and we'll certainly announce it once we're able to get that through. So having said that, I don't necessarily need everything that the server provides. As a client, I'm doing very refined things. In fact, so far, I've only defined 4 operations. Let's look at get inventory. So when I populate that front page, I basically have defined this get inventory, and I'm telling it exactly what properties I need. I want to go ahead and pull the images back. I want to get the name of the manufacturer, etc. This is exactly something, in fact, the way that I composed this was I went into Banana Popcake and I experimented with what I would like to receive, and that's what I came up with. And so you can see I can just paste it in there and use it. However, because this has a GraphQL extension, this means that GraphQL's source generator will pick this up and automatically generate a client for me. Now, I don't have it turned on because I didn't want it checked into source control, but you can tell it to generate the files so you can browse the source. And IntelliSense is something I use heavily, so I'm fine with that. But let's just look at the index page. And so I've got a workflow that steps through the different steps. Let me show you what a request looks like. Solver workflow. Okay, so my first step in the workflow is I'm getting the inventory. So this client is what's generated by Strawberry Shake. And if you look up, it's just called Astro Client. Right here, Astro Client. And I have it injected as a service. If we look at the startup in my client, I'm basically telling it to add the Astro Client. And then I'm configuring an HTTP address to make the GraphQL request. I apologize, this is bad practice. I hard-coded the URL. Normally you'd have a configuration file and pull it from there, which is what the final solution when I commit that will have. And then I also configure a WebSocket client. That is what we're configuring for the real-time subscription updates that we'll get to in a minute. So going back to the code, I get the client. If you notice here in my GraphQL file, I called it get inventory. So the client itself is called get inventory, and I just execute it, and then I get results, and the results are exactly what I would expect, a list of inventory. I can use a link query. So what I'm doing is I'm getting all of the components. Then I'm telling it, put the targets in one set, put the sensors in another set, leave the rest as the regular inventory. So that's it. That client's generated. It's an async request. I get strongly typed C# objects, and I'm good to go. Now, the way that these objects come back is because you have the flexibility to define just the properties you want, you get an interface by default. See this? This is a I get inventory underscore inventory. So it's a very logical interface. It's based on the request and the node off the request. And that just has the shape of data that you defined in your schema. If you want to create components that just work with your domain objects, you can. And you can use a mapper, for example, to project, or there's some other ways to say, even though I'm getting these 3 fields, go ahead and pass it as a full inventory object, just leave the other fields at default, for example. So the specification that we looked at in the client contained the service specification, any extensions to it, which is like the types and the filters, and variables. Variables are something that I'm going to show you now, because what happens if you have a request? So when I submit a job, that job looks like this. That's the wrong one. Oh, there we go. So this is me submitting a problem. Basically, I'm sending it the ID of the telescope I'm solving, the ID of the camera, the list of components I want to be part of the solution, and how much back focus tolerance, like how far off of, sometimes you can't get perfect back focus. So what percentage deviation am I willing to go with? You can see here, I'm defining variables in this request. Target ID is a GUID, sensor ID is a GUID, components is an array of GUIDs, etc. And I can get these directly off the schema that I had. So this is the query as it's exposed to the client. Inside the braces is the actual node that's exposed on the server. So on the node, we have something called solution subscription ID. So what I can do is I can take this and pop it right into Banana Popcake. So here I'm requesting, and I'm going to just move these out to separate lines. So I'm requesting it with basically this payload. Up here, it defines the payload for my client. Then here it's projecting onto the server. Now this one is a very simple example because it just returns a correlation ID. I'm going to show you a more complex example in a minute. But here in Banana Popcake, I can actually fill these in. So let's go over here and let's do inventory. Let's just do ID and component type. And then I'm going to grab a OTA. There's an OTA right there. I have no clue which one it is, but we'll just grab this GUID. And if I remember this correctly, I can say target ID Okay, so now it knows the target ID. What's it complaining about? No, that can't be right. Hold on. Let's see. All right, I'm not going to fumble with this too much, but you can basically specify the replacements. What I could do is just make this hard-coded, so I can do this, and then just pass this in as this. And then we'll get a sensor ID. So that's going to be I think I just called it a sensor. So we'll grab this one. And then a list of components and so forth. So you can see how you would build this. Now I can actually run this query and get a correlation ID and run subscriptions. But I want to show you how mutations work first, and then we'll come back and look at subscriptions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. I think we're going a little bit, oh, we got some time. So let's do that. Let's look at mutations really quickly. So a mutation is basically a query with a side effect. So the syntax looks very familiar, and I told you I'd show you one since I didn't finish this demo. I have a repo out there called star repo. That is another solution that you can play around with, also astronomy themed. But if we look at star repo, there is a mutation defined in this. And I'm going to go into the client. So upsert telescope is a mutation. And basically what I'm doing is passing it a telescope and then calling this modify telescope. And then these are the components, just like with a query, this will return something. In this case, I'm giving it an ID, success, and a message, but I can pick exactly what I want back. So it's just like a query. In fact, queries can have variables and everything else. The only thing is, because I marked this mutation, that's a signal that says this is going to have a side effect. So straight query, no side effects. Something with a side effect is marked as a mutation. It's used almost the exact same way as queries are. And if I can, let's see, we'll go into edit. So that's edit, blah, blah, blah. And where's, oh, I did a service here. I wanted to show you, but it's basically going to be the same thing. It's going to be an async with parameters in it. So let me pop back over to this project and show you what a request looks like. So I'm going to go into my submission workflow. And the first thing I do is I ask for a correlation ID. So here I'm submitting the problem. I got the client. Well, let me show you the definition first. So this is how I kick it off. This is what I was showing you with these components in it. So if we look at the code, I'm basically passing it target ID, sensor ID, getting the list of inventory IDs. Right now it's got a back focus tolerance hard-coded to 0.1. And then I simply await it and get the result back. So it's a very familiar idiomatic C# way to call this. And basically you just get that result back and you run with it. In the case of a mutation, it looks exactly the same, but what I'd return back is probably the object populated with its database ID, for example, or just a confirmation that it worked. So that's the difference there. But the thing that I think is really powerful with this is subscriptions. So subscriptions work like this. You basically define the subscription, you configure it, you give it a provider, and then you publish. So you need something to coordinate the subscriptions. Right now, this demo is using what's called an in-memory provider, so it's just keeping track of subscriptions and publications in memory. But there's also a Redis provider for this, and it's designed so that you could write other providers for the synchronization, basically for a scaled out system as a pub sub backend. So there's Redis, and then we have some offerings at Microsoft that can fit in there, et cetera. And then, so that's the server, that's the client. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go to the server, and I'm going to show you how I defined a subscription. So this is real-time updates. So I created a class in my GraphQL project. Oh, by the way, here's a mutation, which is just save the solution, and it's just returning the result. So very similar to query. And I actually simplified that, so I can take that off. But a subscription looks like this. So I have two things that you can subscribe to. While it's running, you can subscribe to the updates. So you get a refresh of that's where you saw how many solutions were in progress, how many had finished, etc. And then when it's solved, you can just request that final solution. So here I've got a tag that Hot Chocolate provides, subscribe and resolve, problem solved. What it takes in is a correlation ID. So I might have a channel of problems solved, but I don't want to see everyone's problems. I just want to deal with my own. And so that correlation ID is how I subscribe it to a topic. So that goes into this unique string that's basically correlation ID final solution. And what I'm telling it to do is when the task is activated, parse the correlation ID, and then I'm configuring false because I'm doing a background workflow engine thing here. But it's basically just going out, asking this, and then it's going to provide it. So this is just configuring. This is just saying, here's a service you can subscribe to. That's it. We need to publish this somewhere. So the publication happens. Where does the publication happen? That's in my solution processing service. So I've basically got a queue of these requests that come in. And I call my service. Remember, I wrote this so that it can be run just from a console app. I've actually fitted it to run in a web app. It's flexible like that. And what you do is you call it, you give it the inputs, and then you give it some callbacks to get statistics, event stats, and a correlation ID. And then I run that. When I want to raise an event, so let's say I've subscribed to I want a solution event. Now I want to raise that. All I do is in my service itself, I injected this iTopic event center. So this is configured by Hot Chocolate. It gets injected for me. And then I can simply come in and say, event sender, send the topic name and the payload. So remember, the topic name is unique because I'm using that correlation ID. It doesn't have to be, but I've chosen for it to be. This is the solution. So again, very straightforward, send async. And here's the updates. So when I get updates in progress, I just call event sender. So a similar thing could happen, for example, if you want to notify when one of your objects is mutated. So in my star repo example, when you edit a telescope, it publishes a telescope modified event. That way the grid can listen to that and auto refresh the grid when that happens. So that's on the server side. We basically did two things. We defined what the service was, and this is just getting the details of what is the type of the payload and what is the unique topic ID. Doesn't have to be unique. I could take this correlation ID off and just have a very open channel. And then you raise the event somewhere. And then in the middleware, let's go right here. I registered these services as global services, so they're injected into any constructor where I need them. And then I'm adding in-memory subscriptions. So a provider will basically provide this extension method. So I can do in-memory, I could add a Redis provider here, or if another provider gets written, that's where I would add it in. So it's basically just registered the subscription type here, and then add the in-memory subscriptions. Now we go to the client because the client wants to consume the subscription. So that has a similar set of steps. So in my Strawberry Shake client, I am going to come in here and I'm adding the WebSocket client here. So that's how it's communicating the real-time updates. I've defined the schema here. So this is a get solution updates. So basically I'm telling it, this is again, my client is called get solution updates, and it takes a variable of a string. The GraphQL client has this node called solution updated that takes this parameter. It could take 5 parameters and I might pass defaults to it. I have total flexibility. And these are the pieces I want back. Basically the event type, some pieces of the solution, and some statistics that I haven't wired in yet. By saving that, if you notice down here, the build action is C# analyzer additional file. Strawberry Shake will pick this up when I build, generate a client, and then if we go to my submission workflow, you can see that here I'm subscribing to updates. Client, get solution updates, which is the name I gave it here. And then I'm using this watch command. That's how we subscribe. Remember, it had a parameter, so it wants the topic. So I'm passing it correlation ID as the topic. And then I've installed system reactive link because the return of this is a iObservable, which is an object that you can interface with and you can do certain things with to deal with the result. But with reactive link, I can just make it look like a link query. Basically, the stream of results coming from this are going to look like a link query. So I'm telling it filter out the ones that have, or I'm sorry, filter down to the message data. I don't care about the payload wrapper. And then subscribe on next update message. So this is all the code it takes to subscribe to that update. Now this is disposable, so I've created a reference to it. Down here, I simply set the property and notify Blazor that the status has changed. And then I have a component that binds to the values and shows them. It's just as simple as that. And then when I get the final update, I dispose my watchers because I know I'm not going to be doing anything else with that particular result. Because one workflow is one correlation ID, basically. And that's it. That's subscriptions. So the other two things that I didn't cover were defer. And what defer looks like is basically in my schema, let's say I want the image to come back later, I would do this at defer. And then when I call this query, I can give a callback that will basically call me when that information is available, and then I can append it into the collection. It basically gets patched in. There are, if you work with Blazor, there are Blazor specific extensions to Strawberry Shake being written that actually allow you to take a component, point it at a schema, and have it kind of wire up most of the logistics for it. It's completely brand new. I haven't had time to vet or test it, so I didn't demo it, but that's also coming down the pipeline, and just the way that the building blocks are put together make it possible. So having said all of that, I've got a very special slide. I designed this myself. I take full credit for it. It says thank you and has the link to the Astro adapter. So this is going to be an actual product that I'll use. So my plan is to finish this implementation with the Blazor WASM client so I can show the GraphQL functionality. But then I will build a Blazor WASM client with embedded SQLite. So if you're not aware of this, the SQLite team released a version that runs on WebAssembly. So you can now include that as a package and use EF Core and just run your EF Core SQLite code in the browser. So I can have a completely standalone application and basically just save the database out to local storage, make it as a progressive web app, and then anyone on any machine can install it and use it and play with it. So that's the goal for it. We'll see how the timeline works out with all the things happening. But having said that, thank you so much for your time and attention. I will certainly hang out for questions. They can be related to this or other topics. If you have general questions about Microsoft, data, things outside of data, pastimes, whatever, happy to do that. And I'll turn the floor over to Sam.
Thanks, Jeremy. Does anyone have any questions for Jeremy? One last call. All right. If not, I have a couple questions for you.
All right.
So would I be able to access metadata from GraphQL? Meaning, can I query all the table names that are available in the schema?
So you can query the schema directly, and you'll get everything that's exposed to the API. If you wanted to query all the tables in an actual database, you would just need to wire up a resolver that grabs the tables and expose it as a node on that GraphQL endpoint. So what you're saying is possible. There's two concepts. There's the graph that's exposed to the schema, and then there's that step of mapping the tables to the graph. So I don't think that's an automatic thing where it'll pull back the underlying table information, but it's certainly something that should be straightforward to do.
Okay, gotcha. And then would I be able to call and execute store procedures if I know the name of the store procedure?
Again, what GraphQL will do is it'll just present a set of nodes as a result, but as part of the resolver, there's no reason why you can't call a store procedure. So you might say, so I have account, sales, orders, invoice, but maybe invoice actually needs a store procedure because it does some sort of computation. Then I would just simply use the regular link queries for everything. Then when it comes to the invoice, I would do an EF call to the store procedure, shape it based on that data, and that resolver would just do a store procedure call instead of doing a link query. And then that would be exposed up through the rest of the system, basically.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. I see Arthur's not muted. Do you have a question, Arthur?
Just a couple quick questions. Jeremy, I noticed that you had the client and server projects broken out. Was there a specific reason why that was?
So if you mean broken out as far, oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, there was because I plan on doing, I know what you mean. So it wasn't an ASP.NET Core hosted project, basically. It was two separate, and that's really just the way I evolved the project. I kind of built from the back end up. So I built all the logic, made sure it ran, did a console app to do that, and then I said, well, let me stand up the GraphQL API, and if that's as far as I get, I can use Banana Popcake to show that. Once I had that stood up, I was like, great, let me do a client. Because one of my visions was, before I figured out that I could use the SQLite in the browser, was to make a lightweight version of this that might have a local client that is just a static, either Blazor WebAssembly that you could drop, and then you could run the server separately and still access the functionality, if that makes sense. But it could certainly work as an ASP.NET Core hosted project as well, and then there'd be more sharing of data between the two sides.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought, and I know you had mentioned it briefly, but just kind of curious. Also wondering, is that sort of leading best practice to kind of use that kind of like model, like to build up separately, build up on the back end with the idea of making it as flexible as possible? Is that kind of what you're seeing from a Microsoft perspective?
I'm seeing both actually. A lot of times it's built with the intent to drive a single application, so it'll be an ASP.NET Core hosted application, and those will be together. And then there's some services that are really just, we have a lot of teams that just expose services. They don't deal with the client at all. So they're just presenting a service to other teams within the company or other services within the company. And so they'll just stand up a standalone endpoint and then everything else can consume it. And that's actually popular in a lot of the companies I talk to, because one common scenario for this is to take WCF and REST backends and expose them as a GraphQL client. And then all of your client development can use modern GraphQL clients moving forward, and you can take the time to migrate the backend APIs as needed.
Awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Steve C., did you have a question for Jeremy?
Yes, I do. So this is really interesting, and the meeting was very timely because this is something I've been looking at for work. One thing I'm curious, where I work, which is a is a bank. There's a couple of us who are interested in developing chatbot sort of applications, and I wonder if there's been any sort of research or work on converting sort of natural language queries into, I guess, a GraphQL type of query, so that because you'll ask for all kinds of things at a bank, looking for somebody with a certain industry or their past due or whatever it may be. Has anybody been doing that?
I can't say if they have or not. I have not come across it. That's certainly a very interesting idea. And I work as part of .NET Data. I work with our ML.NET teams and
Mm-hmm.
our AI team. So it's a very interesting concept. But no, I haven't come across that specific combination of using some sort of translation of like natural language into, for example, GraphQL endpoint. But very,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting concept for sure.
Okay. Well, I was
Steve,
hoping. Thank
if
you.
you want to reach out to me afterwards, I'll make my email available. I have worked with Lewis or the Language Understanding Intelligence Service. So we can work out a way where you can do it. It's just not straight out of the box, but we can talk more about that offline.
Yeah, I'd love to. I've seen demos of Lewis and some of that stuff up on Azure. I'd be very interested in talking to you.
Sure, I'll make my email available and you can contact me afterwards.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam.
My pleasure. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
I had a quick question, a real basic one because I've never used GraphQL. Is it meant more kind of like a stand-in in place of something like Web API, or is it fulfilling like a different role?
It would be something that replaces Web API. It's the type of API. If you're requesting data for a front end, then that's what you would use. If you're doing something like a procedural call, like if you have an endpoint that's meant to kick off a task or something, then it starts getting creative because it can stand in like the way I did it. It was I have a submission that gets a correlation ID. And then that correlation ID you can subscribe to and get updates. That's really like an RPC thing. So I'm sort of overloading the graph model to make my request the way I want to. But you could do this in addition to or in spite of Web API. There are more and more customers driving to GraphQL as a technology. I can tell you at Microsoft, a lot of the teams are converging on that as kind of a standard API offering as a way that they feel will have the most availability to clients to easily consume and do the things that they want to. So in that case, it would be replacing all Web API endpoints. And there's certainly a lot of companies that are moving all in to GraphQL. And what they're doing is they're putting GraphQL in front of their Web API so that code basically is just looking at GraphQL endpoint. It's getting relayed to the Web API until they can promote it to an actual just GraphQL endpoint.
Okay, so this almost sounds more like it'd be a fit for something like an experience API layer, of an application, whereas you have other lower level APIs maybe not using this tech talking to each other. This would kind of be like your client. And
yeah, I would use this mainly for my client. If I'm doing back-end microservice calls, then I wouldn't. There's certainly people doing it, but it's not what it was designed for, and I'd probably look at either direct web API or something like gRPC because of the binary serialization. Although it is interesting, people are talking about doing like GraphQL over gRPC, which makes it even more interesting, but that's a interesting concept for another day.
That it would be. Any other questions or comments for Jeremy? Pardon me. All right, I think that wraps it up as far as questions go. Jeremy, thank you very much. Highly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And let me, if I may, take control back and just have some closing announcements. So the meeting, as you know, is being recorded and will be edited shortly afterwards and will be uploaded to YouTube. If you'd like, you can subscribe to the channel and you'll get notifications when the video is uploaded, and I made that link available in chat. In addition, tech events that we'll cover in just a minute will be posted on my blog, samnasser.blogspot.com. And the feedback eval, the link is also made available in the chat. If you would please take a minute to fill that out so we can provide Jeremy some feedback. Also, if you missed the opening announcement about the special offer from Manning, we get 35% off using the discount code MTPCLEC21. And the link is also provided there at the bottom of the slide and also made available in chat. So for tech events, tonight, if you're interested, predicting flights with Azure Databricks, that's going to be provided by Sarah Dukevich, or also known as Saduki. She's going to be presenting to a group in Arizona, which will be starting at 9 o'clock Eastern. So the beauty of online meetings, you can jump from one city to another just by the click of a button. And she'll be presenting that tonight starting at 9 p.m. On March 29th, I will be presenting machine learning in .NET to the Edmonton user group. And that's going to be happening at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time with the link available on Meetup. On April 4th, which is the first Tuesday of every month, is the Ohio North Database Training Group. And they're going to be discussing, if I remember correctly, anti-patterns in T-SQL. And then on April 13th is the Azure Cleveland user group. And there we're going to have Donovan Brown discussing Helm and its use. And on April 21st is the glug.net, or the Great Lakes Users Group.net. And we're going to be having Kevin Griffin discussing how we can boost performance in ASP.NET applications. On April 28th is the April meeting of this group. And we are scheduled to have a talk on dependency injection. And you can find the meeting information posted on the Meetup site as well. As we always do, I'd like to thank TechSystems for being a longtime sponsor, and they always provide job openings available at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. In addition, always like to ask, who's hiring? Feel free to enter it into chat or to verbally speak up. Anyone know of anyone who's hiring?
Sure.
And who would that be?
This is Lou. I'm actually leaving my position, so if someone wants to backfill it, there'll be an opportunity there at MetaQuant for a SQL DBA application developer. Someone that could know some .NET would be really good on top of that.
Very good. And you said that's MetaQuant?
MetaQuant in
Okay.
Brecksville.
Very good. Anyone else? Arthur K., I'm hiring Nexstar Network. And what's the URL for that, Arthur?
Let me throw it in the chat here. Let me grab it. I'm hiring
Okay.
for one contract position, which is for 6 months, and then 4 full-time developer positions, some back end, some front end. Nexstar.
Okay, so once the URL is made available, I will share it with the group as well.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Jeremy, is Microsoft hiring? He beat me to it.
Always
Always
hiring.
hiring. All right.
Yeah.
Careers.microsoft.com.
Yeah, I don't think there will be a minute in time when you go to that site and do not find a technical position somewhere. So, and as my personal story suggests, don't rule yourself out. I kind of wrote off working for Microsoft. I didn't think I would be good enough to qualify and go through the technical interviews and everything else. And it was a pleasant surprise to find out that they were willing to have me. So I encourage you to check that out.
Very nice. Thank you. And on the opposite end of the token, anyone who's looking for work? Going once, twice.
Yeah, that'd be me, Sam.
Okay, go ahead, John.
So the good folks at Trimble have dispensed with a few folks. So basically, my background is VB.NET, C#, SQL, for a decade or two. So.
Gotcha. Okay. So you have the links available in chat, and if I hear of anything, I will pass it along. And
Appreciate
good to hear from you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, good to hear your voice.
Thank you, sir. All right. In closing, my contact information, if needed, snasser@nistechnologies.com. Always happy to help someone, whether it be a technical question or finding work or anything else. You can also find me on Twitter @SamNasser, and my blog where I post technical events as well as various articles, samnasser.blogspot.com. And lastly, I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. So with that, thanks again to Jeremy, and thanks to everyone who attended, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night, everyone.